If you've been using Windows for years and you're even slightly curious about Linux, you've probably had the same thought I did. Is there a Linux distro that feels just like Windows but better? Not just similar? Not just kind of familiar? I mean something that you can install, sit down in front of, and immediately feel at home. No steep learning curve. No weird desktop layouts. No hunting for basic settings. Just power on and go. So I decided to do something a little extreme. I tried every major Windows-like Linux distro I could find. I installed them on real hardware, not just virtual machines. I used them for work, for browsing, for editing, for gaming, for file management, for everything I normally do on Windows. And after weeks of testing, tweaking, and occasionally breaking things, only one truly replaced Windows for me. But to understand why, you need to see what I went through first. Before diving into specific distros, I set some ground rules. The distro had to be visually familiar to a Windows user. That means a taskbar at the bottom, a start menu style launcher, system tray icons, window controls where you expect them, and a file manager that doesn't feel alien. It also had to support common Windows workflows, easy software installation, good driver support, simple updates, and preferably decent gaming compatibility through tools like Proton and Wine. If I had to spend hours in the terminal just to get Wi-Fi working, it was out. If basic settings were buried under obscure menus, it was out. I wanted something I could recommend to someone who has only ever used Windows 10 or 11 and is nervous about switching. The first distro I tried was Zorin OS. Zorin has built its entire brand around being friendly to Windows users. And honestly, I could see why the moment I booted into the desktop. The layout was clean, modern, and instantly familiar. The taskbar at the bottom, the start menu in the corner, pinned apps, system tray, it all felt like a polished version of Windows 10. The animations were smooth, the design language was cohesive, and nothing felt experimental. Under the hood, Zorin is based on Ubuntu, which means it benefits from a massive ecosystem of software and community support. Installing apps was simple through the software store, and I didn't have to touch the terminal for most tasks. Hardware support was solid, my Wi-Fi worked immediately, and even my Bluetooth headphones paired without drama. But after using Zorin for several days, I started noticing small friction points. The customization options were good, but some features I wanted required the Pro version. That wasn't a deal breaker, but it did make me pause. Also, while it felt Windows-like on the surface, some deeper settings still followed GNOME's logic. GNOME is powerful, but it's not exactly Windows in how it handles workspaces, extensions, and system tweaks. I could adapt, but I kept thinking, if I'm recommending this to a complete beginner, will they get confused once they dig deeper? Next, I tried Linux Mint, specifically the Cinnamon edition. If you've ever searched for best Linux distro for Windows users, Mint is almost always at the top of the list. And within minutes of logging in, I understood why. Cinnamon looks like a refined, cleaner Windows 7 with modern touches. The start menu is straightforward, the taskbar is familiar, right-click context menus behave logically, and the file manager feels comfortable. Mint has its own update manager that's clear and easy to use, doesn't overwhelm you with technical jargon, it tells you what updates are safe, what's recommended, and what's optional. What really impressed me about Mint was stability. It felt rock solid. I installed drivers, ran updates, installed apps, customized the theme, and nothing broke. It just worked. For someone coming from Windows, that reliability is huge. Gaming through Steam was surprisingly smooth. Proton handled many of my Windows games without extra configuration. Office alternatives like LibreOffice worked out of the box. Browsing, streaming, even light video editing, it handled everything gracefully. But visually, it still looked a little dated compared to modern Windows 11. Not ugly, just less flashy. And while that might not matter to everyone, aesthetics do influence first impressions. Then I moved to KDE-based distros, starting with Kubuntu. KDE Plasma is known for being highly customizable and visually can look extremely close to Windows 10 or 11 with minimal tweaking. Out of the box, Kubuntu already felt familiar. The start menu, taskbar, and system tray were where I expected them. But what blew me away was how deep the customization went. I could adjust panel behavior, window animations, themes, icons, fonts, and more, all through graphical settings menus. No terminal required. If I wanted it to look like Windows 11 with centered icons, I could do that. If I wanted a classic Windows 7 layout, I could do that too. However, that flexibility came with complexity. KDE has a lot of options. For a power user, that's a dream. For a beginner, it can be overwhelming. There are menus inside menus. Advanced settings are just a click away, and it's easy to get lost. Still, performance was impressive. KDE Plasma is lightweight these days, and it ran smoothly even on older hardware I tested. But I noticed occasional quirks, minor UI inconsistencies, small glitches after certain updates. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to remind me that this isn't Windows. It's Linux wearing a Windows-inspired suit. After that, I tested WindowsFX, which markets itself as a Linux distribution that looks almost exactly like Windows 11. And I have to admit, at first glance it was almost uncanny. The layout, icons, and overall visual presentation closely mirrored Windows. For someone who wants the least visual shock possible, this is as close as it gets. But as I used it more, I realized that imitation alone isn't enough. Some parts felt more like a theme layered on top of Linux rather than a deeply integrated experience. Performance was decent, but not as smooth as Mint or Zorin on the same hardware. I also felt slightly uneasy about how closely it mimicked Microsoft's design language. It was impressive, but I wasn't convinced it was the long-term solution. Then came the more subtle candidates, distros that aren't aggressively Windows-like, but can be made to feel that way. Fedora with KDE Plasma, for example, was powerful and cutting-edge. Fedora is known for being close to upstream software, meaning you get newer packages and features faster. But that also means more frequent updates and potentially more changes. It felt less like a stable replacement for a Windows user and more like a playground for someone who enjoys tinkering. It was fast, polished, and modern, but not necessarily beginner-focused. As I rotated through these systems, I kept asking myself one question. Can I stop thinking about Windows entirely? That was the real test. Not just whether the distro looks like Windows, but whether it replaces the Windows mindset. Can I install software easily? Can I manage files without confusion? Can one connect peripherals, install printers, manage updates, and game without headaches? Can I trust it for daily work? And that's when I realized something surprising. The distro that truly replaced Windows for me wasn't the one that looked the most like Windows. It was the one that felt the most stable, predictable, and user-friendly while still being flexible. It was Linux Mint Cinnamon. Mint didn't try too hard to mimic Windows 11's exact visuals. Instead, it focused on delivering a familiar workflow, and that's what matters most. The Start menu is intuitive. The system settings are organized logically. The Update Manager is transparent and non-intimidating. Driver management is straightforward. I installed NVIDIA drivers with a few clicks. Steam installed easily. Proton worked. My productivity apps were available. For the few Windows-only programs I needed, Wine handled them surprisingly well. What really sealed the deal was how Mint handled updates. On Windows, updates often feel intrusive. Restarts at inconvenient times, forced reboots, background downloads that slow things down. On Mint, updates are in your control. You choose when to install them. You choose when to reboot. The system feels like it belongs to you, not the other way around. That psychological shift is powerful. Performance was another key factor. On the same hardware where Windows 11 felt slightly sluggish, Mint felt light and responsive. Boot times were faster. RAM usage at idle was lower. Even on an older laptop, Mint breathed new life into the machine. It didn't just replace Windows. It outperformed it in daily responsiveness. Of course, no system is perfect. There were moments when I had to search online for solutions. Some niche software required alternatives. But I found that Linux's community-driven nature was a strength, not a weakness. Forums, documentation, and tutorials were everywhere. And because Mint is based on Ubuntu, solutions were widely applicable. By the end of my experiment, I had stopped dual booting. I'd stopped thinking, I'll switch back to Windows for this. That was the turning point. Mint wasn't just a Windows-like distro. It became my primary system. It handled my workflow without drama. It respected my choices. It stayed out of my way. If you're a lifelong Windows user thinking about switching, Here's the truth. The perfect one-to-one replacement doesn't exist. Linux is different by design. But some distros make that transition so smooth that the difference becomes a strength rather than a barrier. You don't need an exact clone of Windows. You need something that feels comfortable, stable, and empowering. For me, after trying Zorin, Kubuntu, WindowsFX, Fedora, KDE, and more, only Linux Mint Cinnamon truly replaced Windows. It's not because it copied it perfectly, but because it respected the workflow Windows users are used to while delivering the freedom and performance Linux is known for. In the end, the real replacement for Windows wasn't about visuals. It was about control, performance, and trust. And once I realized that, going back to Windows didn't even cross my mind anymore.